One remark before I start my presentation. Boris told me that you have already discussed the crisis the days before, so I try to make it short, but I would like to describe my view, especially of the assumed geniform character of the crisis, its double phase. This seems to me important not only to understand the actual capitalism and the way it makes up a new story, but also to make it comprehensible why I am nevertheless optimistic for the future. Of course, given the short time available, I try to speak no longer than 40 minutes. I will have to concentrate on a limited number of main points. I hope I address those that are just as important to you as to me. I will mainly deal with one connection: what kind of crisis in capitalism we are actually dealing with here, and why is it that the left in Europe are not able to present a convincing alternative despite the deep economic and political crisis of the real existing capitalism and its institutions, or at least even offer alternative concepts that are considered convincing, so convincing that much more people vote left, become members of left parties and left initiatives, and demand, work and struggle for the implementation of left-wing alternatives. Talking about the European left, I know, of course, and admit that there is not one European left. There are dozens. We had a meeting in Brussels last June about the radical left parties in Europe. What a colorful variety. There is not enough time today, and it is not my issue to analyze the different left parties in Europe. I just would like to give you an idea how strong left parties in Europe are today. As you probably know, there are 35 deputies in the European Parliament coming from 14 different countries and representing 16 left parties. These 35 representatives have built one group called Confederal Group of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left, which normally is not able to find common positions. With the same problem, the left European Party is confronted, called the European Left Party. Their 26 member parties are very, very different. I start my short review of left parties in the European North. In Norway, there are two left parties. It's not untypical for the countries in Europe. Two left parties, one radical left socialist party, which was in a coalition government together with the Social Democrats for the last 4 years, and a radical left revolutionary party, Rødt, the Red. The coalition government of Social Democrats and Socialists were diselected a few weeks ago. The Conservatives had won the election. The Socialist Party received only 4.1%. During the last 12 years, they have lost more than 8% of their voters. And the Revolutionary Socialist Party, the Red, received 1.1%. In Finland, the Left Party in Finland is member of the European Left Party, is quite strong and was part of different governments together with the Social Democrats and others since 1995. They received more than 8% in the election of 2011, and they have 14 deputies in the Finnish parliament and are actually part of a coalition government. In Sweden, the Swedish left party, called Vänsterpartiet, received 4.6% 2010 and has 19 deputies in the parliament. And in Denmark, the Red-Green Socialist Party, also a member of the European Left Party, received 6.7% in the 2011 election and has 12 deputies in the Danish parliament. In summary, it can be said that these left parties in Scandinavia more or less belong to the political establishment. Although all of them are more or less anti-capitalist, they took over responsibility in governments that were led by social democratic parties. And all of these left parties in Scandinavia are highly skeptical towards the EU and especially towards the Euro. Let me go to the Czech Republic, where a traditional communist party, the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia, received more than 20% in regional elections 2012. By the way, with 4 deputies in the European Parliament, this Communist Party is the second strongest in the left group in Strasbourg and Brussels. Only the German Party Die Linke, with 8 deputies, is stronger. The Communist Party in the Czech Republic does not belong to the political establishment in this country. To close this review, let me go to the south, to Portugal, where also 2 left parties were very successful in the regional elections a few days ago. The so-called Left Coalition, led by the Communist Party, received more than 11%, and the Left Bloc, the Bloco de Izquierda, received more than 8%. Next country, Greece. You all know the amazing strength of Syriza in Greece. The result in the general election 2012 grew from the first ballot in May 2012 from 17% to nearly 27% on the second ballot in June. Simultaneously, the result of the Greek Communist Party, KKA, declined from 8.5 to 4.5%. Syriza has now 71 deputies in the Greek National Parliament. KKA has 12. What a success, considering that both parties have even gained acceptance since then. I could talk about the disastrous results of the Italian left and communist parties, about good results in Spain for the united left, Izquierda Unida, and about the result of the Socialist Party in the Netherlands 2012 with nearly 10%, which at the end was disappointing anyway because they expected much more. And I should not conceal that it is very difficult, or more precisely, nearly impossible to find left parties in the parliaments of the Eastern European countries, except from the Czech Republic, for Croatia and Moldova. One deputy from Croatia is member of the left group in the European Parliament, as you probably know. What I wanted to make clear is left parties in many European countries are a factor which others, especially our enemies, take very seriously. But, and that should not be kept secret, with the exception of Greece, the left parties in Europe are not seen as a convincing alternative. At its best, and I have my doubts whether this is the best, at its best they are helping social democrats governing and are helping social democrats to make social democratic policy. They are not able to offer their own alternative concepts that are considered convincing by significant portions of the European population. And when I speak of significant portions, I mean 20, 25, 30%. So I'm not even talking about absolute majorities here. However, election results of 2 or even 5% are not enough to speak of a significant portion of the population. I give 2 examples from the recent past. 6.9% received by the Front de Gauche in the first round of the parliamentary election in France in June 2012 can hardly be considered a major success. By the way, the far left in France received almost 1% of the votes, a total of some 250,000. This proportion of left votes is far from sufficient enough to claim a right to have an influence. And it's also hard for me to regard the 8.6% that the left party received 2 weeks ago in Germany to be an expression of the fact that significant groups within the German population would have an interest in fundamentally changing the existing political and economic realities in Germany, although I do not consider 3.7 million votes for the left party to be an insignificant number. Left-wing persuasive power and a claim by the left to influence policy really require different results. The left parties in many European countries are currently an important voice of opposition. They are indispensable as critics of the status quo, particularly the existing inequalities and injustices. They are also valued in this role even beyond their voters and supporters, but they are still far away from being considered a serious and real alternative to the conservatives or the social democrats. And what is true for the left parties is also true for the left social movements. And also here, there is a major difference between the situation in the north, the west, and the east on the one hand, and the south on the other hand. If 10,000 people gather for a left demonstration in a huge German city, let's say for a fair tax system, for example, this is already a success. A general strike in Greece, Spain, or Portugal nowadays is part of normal political life. I do not know, Boris mentioned 20, I do not know how often hundreds of thousands of protesters gain in France, Greece, Spain, or Portugal against the austerity policy of the European Union and their national governments. At the end of the day, we have to confess that the results of these demonstrations were quite disappointing. I would agree that the social movements are important for the dignity and the self-respect of the protesters and the people. And the demonstrations were, of course, a signal for the ruling classes and the governments. And I think those have heard the message. They will keep an eye on the social movements, but they didn't take alarm. The left social movements are an important voice of opposition, but they are not able, maybe with the exception of Greece, to express a real social alternative beyond present capitalism. Under these circumstances, they are not better than other oppositional initiatives. Nonetheless, I look optimistically to the future of the left in Europe and see good opportunities for them to take more influence on the course of developments. Then it is because, in my eyes, the left is the only political force capable of tackling the 3 most important challenges in the present: social justice, democracy, and peace. Let me talk about the crisis. The beginning of the current crisis dates, as you know, back to 2007, when the so-called housing bubble in the United States and in several other countries, such as Spain, brought the banking and financial world into trouble because many real estate transactions, which were financed through loans, turned out to be speculative and unreliable. And this crisis became a global crisis on September 15, 2008, when the American investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed. This bank had been in serious trouble because of their real estate transactions since 2007. Their crash in 2008, triggered by the refusal of the US government to rescue the bank, plunged the financial world around the world into a deep crisis that shook capitalism and put dozens of banks, corporations, and governments in a state of fear, terror, and panic. While the US government let Lehman Brothers go into bankruptcy, in other cases it acted in concert with dozens of other governments according to the principle of too big to fail, saving the banking system from destruction with sums in the trillions. In the 28 EU member states alone, the banks made use of state aid to the amount of 1.6 trillion euro between 2008 and 2010. The German banks, Hypo Real Estate, Commerzbank, IKB Deutsche Industriebank, and various regional banks needed financial support in the amount of 259 billion euros, of which nearly 70 billion was donated aid as bestowed subsidies and about 190 billion as guarantees and collateral. This basically already points out the most important thing about this financial crisis. For many years, banking, insurance, and financial services conducted business, particularly in the construction and property industry, that was neither solid, nor reliable, nor sustainable. They could do this because their business and financial conduct promised great gains in the short term for the banks and financial institutions on the one hand, and the real estate and construction industry on the other. This generated huge profits in a very short time, thus giving the impression that the economy was prospering as a whole. They could also do this business because their dubious machinations were not regulated, restricted, or even monitored by law. And it was also because the greed of profits and earnings of the institutions, alongside the greed of those who invested their money in these institutions or borrowed money from them, was greater than the fear of the existing laws and the fear of failing and losing in the end. They took the opportunities offered to them by capitalism and what the governments and laws in capitalism not only allowed, but even encouraged. They made financial transactions and hoped to make it big. Today, there is agreement among experts, also even among conservatives, that the policy of low interest rates, particularly in the US, and the opportunities for speculation in the property sector, the lenient regulation and scrutiny in the bank sector, and the large income differences between countries and between the lower and middle income earners on the one hand and the wealthier segment of the population on the other side are the significant causes for the development and progress of the crisis. Now, in this situation, when the bubble burst, as the rogue and, yes, criminal financial behavior of many banks, financial service providers, and contractors became clear, when it became apparent that billions had been speculated and not carefully invested and were now lost, the governments, central banks, and the International Monetary Fund could have done what capitalism and neoliberalism in particular suggest as a solution in such cases, namely, to do nothing and rely on the market. Then the companies with the dubious and criminal activities would have gone into bankruptcy. Some of these companies would have been charged and indicted, perhaps even convicted. And in the end, those who had acted too unscrupulously would have been punished. The system would have proven its regulatory strength and capitalism its vitality. And, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the banks, insurance companies, and financial services would have been back on the market with their offers, and capitalism would have proven to be durable, and everything would have continued as before. Isn't this the philosophy of neoliberalism? And what happened in reality? Yes, banks and corporations did collapse. Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest, is the best known example. But at the same time, however, a path was taken by governments, particularly in Europe and in the United States, that implemented a principle in an unprecedented manner in which the majority of Germans at least have seen the key feature of capitalism since then. Capitalism is an economic system in which the capitalists do business and keep the accumulated winnings as undiminished as possible by taxes and fees for themselves. If, contrary to expectations, these dealings do not lead to profits but losses, the capitalists try everything with the help of government not to shoulder these losses themselves, but to unload them on the public, the taxpayers. So instead of letting the banks pay for their machinations and go under, numerous countries felt obliged to keep these endangered banks and financial services alive with huge government grants. Some banks were also nationalized or partially nationalized, then sometimes closed or privatized after some time. I describe this in such detail because I'm convinced that capitalism is treading on very thin ice here, because it is behaving in a way that shows its face and its character, its nature, far more clearly than usual. Because the described approach to solving the outcome of the crisis, this interaction between profit-making and politics at the expense of the general public cannot really be legitimized, especially in Europe, and I am convinced that a large majority of the people in Europe would reject it. And I fear that such a capitalism, therefore, cannot be legalized democratically in the long term or be organized as a democratically structured institution. The institutionalization of profit-making through the open interaction between capital and politics at the expense of the general public is, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of democratically organized capitalism, because the government makes itself the instrument or even the partner in crime of the economy and relinquishes its democratic legitimacy. If the principle of too big to fail becomes the standard of national action and government action, then in times of crisis, and therefore in principle, it only works by eliminating the democratic participation of the voters and the people. I believe you could tell a rather long story if you listed when, where, and to what extent democracy in the various countries in the European Union has been sacrificed in favor of the imposition of economic interest in the past few years. You all know what happened to the governments of Greece, Italy, Spain, or Portugal with the Troika in recent years. There can no longer be any question of democratic interaction between democratically elected or democratically legitimated and controlled institutions in many cases. And policies of the European Union is essentially determined by the leaders of the European Council are no longer really democratically controlled by either the European Parliament or by the national parliaments. In Germany, too big to fail refers to the companies that are considered systemically important. And even that is properly and clearly regulated and defined in a country like Germany. There has been a so-called regulatory policy since 2008, which was passed by the Federal Financial Supervisory Authority in agreement with the Deutsche Bundesbank. This directive was revised and reformulated in May 21st, 2013. Systemically important institutions are defined as those in which a threat to whose existence would trigger significant negative knock-on effects on other banks and could lead to instability in the financial system. Their special importance is due to their size, the intensity of their interbank relationship, and their close interdependence with other countries. Not only that, the German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble was forced to concede due to a parliamentary inquiry in December 2012 that there are 36 companies in Germany that are considered systemically important according to the federal government. He did not name names, but of course these are the big banks and insurance companies as well as large companies in the so-called real economy, which of course are also included. If I have not yet mentioned these, that does not mean that they are not important or did not play an important role since the crisis began. Many of these companies of the real economy suffered from the consequences of the crisis, reporting declines in the production, having to dismiss personnel, having trouble getting loans in the uncertain money market, or, like General Motors, even declare bankruptcy. Indeed, the crisis had reached a level in October, November 2008 that some political leaders and business leaders, the leaders of the capitalist world, not politicians and theoreticians from the socialist camp, felt that the current form of capitalism stood at the precipice and was shortly before its end. It's at this point where I have to mention that the ongoing financial and economic crisis since 2007 has, of course, revealed a number of politically relevant aspects. I have already pointed out the increasing threat to democracy. This crisis had also led to a strengthening of right-wing, xenophobic and nationalist political movements and parties. What the crisis had not led to is an increase in anti-capitalist movements or theories. The fact that the existing capitalism has destroyed value amounting to many trillions of euros, destroyed millions and millions of lives, has driven unemployment in Europe to new record highs, has led to no appreciable increase of public debate about the negative sides of capitalism and the need to overcome it. This is merely an empirical finding. In fact, once again, for the upteen's time, capitalism, this economic and social system, has proven to be more stable and resilient than many expected. In addition, this system has once again proven its creativity and productivity in inventing stories to explain and elaborate on these events, all of which only serve to obscure the reality and to conceal the truth in the end. Because these stories are not about capitalism and the capitalists plunging the people into misery, but it's the people themselves who are doing it. And since these stories are told and illustrated with examples throughout the mass media and at all kinds of public appearances of opinion leaders, they are powerful and effective and are considered by many to be credible. The crisis of the financial industry and the banks in 2007 and 2008, which also impacted the real economy and hence can correctly be characterized as a capitalist financial and economic crisis, was given a new interpretation as a sovereign debt crisis in Europe in 2009, when Greece, followed by other countries in the euro area, had to seek assistance from the European Union in order to avoid a sovereign default as a result. Since then, the concept of the sovereign debt crisis wanders like a ghost on the world in an effort to shift the causes of the crisis from the behavior of banks as an expression of capitalist economics and onto people's behavior as an expression of individual failure. Because they were the ones, according to the current interpretation, that have lived beyond their means for years, worked too little, earned too much, and consumed too much, and thus contributed considerably in the debt of their countries. And according to the more or less clearly pronounced implication, that means that the he who is responsible for the debt crisis must also pay. So it is only appropriate that the lazy Greeks, the lazy Italians, the lazy Spaniards, in short, the lazy Southern Europeans, are now being asked to pay and not to turn to the Northern Europeans to cover their debts. Granted, these interpretations, which can be heard daily not only in German pubs, are completely exaggerated, frivolous, and false. But they are an effective means of disguising the real situation, of hiding those actually responsible to supply large parts of the population with clichés that, in their eyes, are credible. I want to mention another very interesting spectator, namely Mario Barroso, which will also conclude this part of my presentation. The President of the European Commission, who 4 weeks ago on September 12, 2013, had interesting things to say about the crisis in his report on the State of the Union in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. After he had dutifully commented upon the successes that the EU Commission can boast of in the fight against the crisis, he explained to the members of European Parliament that this crisis is not yet over and endured. On the contrary, and I quote Barroso's speech word by word, "These are challenging times," Barroso said, "a real stress test for the EU. The path of permanent and profound reform is as demanding as it is unavoidable. Let's make no mistake," he said. "There is no way back to business as usual. Some people believe that after this, everything will come back as it was before. They are wrong. This crisis is different. This is not a cyclical crisis, but a structural one. We will not come back on the old normal. We have to shape a new normal. We are in a transformative period of history." So Mario Barroso. And I agree with him that the EU is in a transformative period of history. And I would even go a step further. The coming years will determine whether the European Union has a future and its essential provision of tasks, whether the EU as a framework and instrument for the competitiveness of Europe in the world can be created and secured, whether the EU is democratically structured and at the same time can successfully implement the aim of looking after a democratic, social and peaceful Europe in the world. And European Union aiming to have the consent of the European left and the left worldwide must be measured against the latter few of these claims: democratic, social and peaceful, inwardly and outwardly. And this brings me to the conclusion and to the end, to the left-wing alternatives. We, the left, want a democratic, social and peaceful Europe. And I fear that such a Europe can and will exist only if the left is strong enough to ensure this. Currently, the EU violates all three principles. It treads on democracy. In the EU, there are inequality, poverty and hunger, mass unemployment and misery. The poor are getting poorer by the day and the rich get richer. And the impression that EU policy does more for the rich than for the poor is surely not wrong. Finally, the members of the EU violate international law, participate in wars and armed conflicts, and the EU intends to strengthen its military capabilities. In short, the European Union is in deplorable condition and discredits itself every day before its own citizens and the world. Those who want to change that situation, first and foremost, need their own idea of what a democratic, social and peaceful Europe could look like, how it could work, what institutions are needed for this, the role of central institutions and the role to be played by national institutions, how the distribution of power, money and jobs, tasks, rights and obligations in such a Europe could be shared, and much more. And then one would have to make sure to look for supporters for this Europe, to convince the Europeans that internationalism is better than nationalism, that they would do better socially in a united Europe than in their national state without Europe, and that it could work if millions of citizens, rather than a handful of politicians, business and financial professionals, were actively involved in the design of this Europe. The question that remains to be answered is, do we believe that the left in Europe are able to successfully take on this challenge? And I say, yes. I believe the European left will be capable of this in the future, even if I must concede that they are not currently able to do so. However, I see no unsurmountable structural problems that would prevent them from developing a vision and a plan for a left Europe that is capable of winning a majority. To conclude, I still think that a left Europe is not only possible, but that there is also no alternative if we want to hold on to our idea of a social, peaceful and democratic society. And I see in the European left, the trade unions and the left social movements, the forces that are able to push for it and to achieve this goal. However, the basic prerequisite is that they take on this challenge with all of their strength. They are on the right track, but still a ways off to do it in a way that has an effective public resonance. But if the leaders of the left-wing parties in Europe, for example, do not regularly meet at the same time at the meetings of European governmental leaders and present to the public their alternatives to the Europe of Merkel, Cameron, Hollande and Samaras, there can be no left Europe, neither for the left nor for the Europeans. But nobody is actually preventing the Gysis, Mélenchons, Laurents and Tsipras, to mention only these four names, from meeting regularly and presenting the other Europe. I am and will remain optimistic about the left future for Europe. Thank you for your patience.